Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's Legal Aid Queensland webinar on buying a car. My name is Paul Holmes, and I'm a principal lawyer in the Civil Justice Services area of Legal Aid, and I have with me my colleague, Loretta Creek, who is also a principal lawyer in the Civil Justice Services area at Legal Aid. Before we get into today's topic, I'll just remind you of some of our housekeeping rules. This webinar will be recorded and displayed on our YouTube channel after the webinar. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact the GoToWebinar support page. Our webinar will run for approximately 1 hour. Please, if during the webinar you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the question box and we will aim to answer all of the questions that you have before the webinar ends.
Can I just interrupt there, because we were sent some questions as well.
Yeah.
Those questions we're going to try and, if we haven't answered them throughout the presentation, we'll answer them at the end.
Absolutely.
So,
also, there is a handout which are of today's slides available from the menu that will be on your screen. If you're having any problems accessing that, please let us know. But to begin with, what we're going to do is just a couple of quick polls to warm you up and make sure everybody can hear me. So first poll we're going to start with is just a poll on where you work, what area of the country. So I've opened that now. If you'd like to respond to that, that would be great. It's looking like we've got a good mix of people from Southeast Queensland, North Queensland, and a fair few from outside of Queensland. So just a reminder around those of you from outside of Queensland, as I'll close that poll now, that during some of our presentation, we will be referring to specific Queensland acts. And while acts in other states around buying a car are going to be similar, they're not going to be exactly the same. So please be aware of that and get your clients to seek legal advice from a lawyer in your own state.
That's really important, Paul, isn't it? Because I don't give advice to people outside of the state because we don't have the expertise, and really your clients ought to be seeking, and you yourself seeking help from people within your own state about laws that only apply in your state.
Having said that, there will be laws we talk about that do have application right around the country. All right, and one other quick poll, and that's around how regularly you assist people who are struggling with issues around buying a car. So I've just opened that as well. So it's looking like there's probably 2/3 of you that regularly encounter people who are having trouble buying a car. It's just almost edging up towards 3/4, and then a few hardly ever. So our presentation will be a good mix for everybody because it's got the more complicated stuff in it and it's got the basic stuff you need to know.
That's right.
All right, so we might get underway. All right.
And of course, we haven't organised who's going to be starting off at all on the slides at all, but
I think the important place to start, Loretta, and we've done it in the slides, is there's a difference between, in terms of the legal protection you get, between when you buy it from the bloke down the street and when you buy it from a registered caryard.
Exactly.
And I think that's a really important bit because that affects whether or not you have a cooling off period, for example, and all types of variety of protections that you would get when you buy it from a car yard that you don't necessarily get when you buy it from a private owner.
In fact, that's going to be, I think, one of the warnings that we have coming out of this webinar is, in fact, that very point that, yes, it might be cheaper to buy something privately, but it's a lot more difficult to do something about it when things go wrong.
And Loretta, of course, we can't have a webinar about buying a car without talking about add-on insurance. And
yes,
What's been happening in that space?
I was counting up all the contracts that you might enter into when you go into a caryard.
Yeah.
Which I'll talk about later on, and I'm thinking, whoa, most people would not understand how many contracts there are. In fact, this is a perfect opportunity given we're on a contract slide.
Yes, absolutely. So I guess the thing about lack of understanding from clients is they might say, I can't have entered a contract, I haven't signed anything.
And do you know what example I always give about this?
No, tell me.
It's buying the loaf of bread.
This is true.
Yeah. I say when you go into a supermarket and you have your money to pay for the loaf of bread, you have just completed a contract. And so most contracts that we enter into hundreds each year, possibly thousands, and most of them won't be written contracts. Most of them will be spoken contracts, and only very few will actually require written contracts.
And one of those which we're coming to is cars.
In Queensland, it's cars.
But before we go more specific, if you enter into a contract, are you always bound?
Well, not necessarily, but we always go on the basis that you shouldn't sign a contract unless you know it could be very difficult to exit that contract. And some of the things that you might not be bound is if you've got a cooling off period. Do you have a cooling off period for a used car?
And the answer is what?
It's so long. It's just one day in Queensland. But do we have a cooling off period if you're buying a new car?
No.
No. So we've often had people come in to us who've said, but I should be able to cancel this contract because I've got a cooling off period. And I've said, well, you bought a new car.
The answer is no, you can't.
No. Before, can I just go back, Paul, because I just wanted to talk a little bit about buying a car and how many contracts it can include. So there's first the car purchase, which is usually a contract, and you can add some more of these. Then you've got the various insurance contracts that you could enter into. So that's your comprehensive car insurance, your consumer credit insurance, your shortfall or gap insurance.
Don't forget tyre and rim.
Tyre and rim. We're up to 5 contracts altogether. Your loan contract. The warranty contract that you might get. A servicing contract that you could get. And the brokerage contract.
So we're up to 9?
9, yes. So I think it's a real minefield for people out there. It's not easy.
Particularly when you've been at the car yard for 4 or 5 hours, as we've both seen examples, and the only thing you want to do is buy the damn car and get out of there.
Can I disclose something to you, Paul? No, I'm sure you'll keep it to yourself.
Well, between us and the 60 odd people that are listening in.
So I've never, because I've been working in this area for such a long time, I'm so terrified of going into a car yard to buy a car. I've never bought a car from a car yard.
Look, and I guess that's shaped in a way, Loretta, by our experience of the types of things we see with clients.
Exactly.
But before we dive into car yards, let's talk about private purchases, because I think a lot of people do end up buying a car privately.
Yeah, and this slide is really a summary of what we're going to talk in the next few slides. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what private purchases are, because sometimes people don't even think about that. So it's not just buying the car from your family, friend, your neighbour, but it's also about buying your car from Gumtree, carsales.com, eBay, unless there is a motor dealer who is advertising on those platforms. So sometimes we'll get people saying to us, but I bought the car from eBay, shouldn't they be responsible for the condition of the car? No.
No.
They're just the platform that's selling those cars. And so I always say to people, if they're buying a car privately, it's when they buy it not from a car yard.
Mm.
Now, we have though had some people who should be motor dealers and haven't been motor dealers selling on these platforms, but that's a different question.
And that's a question, if you encounter people in that scenario who really are registered motor dealers masquerading as somebody else, your local Office of Fair Trading is the right person or the right regulator to start with there.
Yes, because they can investigate whether the person selling the car is in the business of selling cars.
And if they are, they're acting without a license, and there are things that Fair Trading or your equivalent can do.
Yes. So the things that we're going to cover in the next few slides are sort of the things that we think you should do before you buy something privately. Is that's check the market value, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Independent reports about the condition.
And then always check for a mortgage.
Yeah, the PPSR. That's one of the most important. And just some advice about transferring registration in Queensland. But those two in particular, those things about buying cars privately are really things that have application nationally. Things about transferring the registration is, of course, something that is state-based, and you would have to look in your state as to how you would go about it.
Okay, we're getting a couple of messages that people are struggling with the sound a little bit. Can I just see whether that's happening for everybody?
Oh, you're so onto it, Paul. Maybe it's because I have such a quiet voice.
So we'll try speaking a bit louder and see if that solves some of the problem.
Yes.
All right, so where we're at then, Loretta, let's talk about independent reports.
Paul.
All right, so I guess the thing to remember about buying a car privately is all of your usual protections like consumer guarantees, and with a used car, Queensland has statutory warranties. They don't apply if you buy it privately. They only apply if you're buying it from a registered motor dealer.
Mm.
So what that means is you've got less protection. And what that means, and thank you to Queensland Office for Trading who are online, so we may use you, and we'll look for comments if we get any of this wrong.
Yes, please pull us up.
But the thing about buying a car privately for me is you need to go and get the independent report, because that's the way you satisfy yourself that this car is of the quality that the private seller is advertising it as. I would also, and this is the other really important point, if you don't take it for a drive, you're not going to have an idea either. And it's often good to take somebody with you who's experienced and who knows a little bit about mechanics, so that they can give you their view on whether what you're buying is actually what was advertised. And I think that's really important. So that independent vehicle report, taking somebody along, really important if you're buying something privately. Market value, Loretta.
Oh, I love this. And I wish we could do this now. I did ask Linda whether we could actually go into
No.
Oh,
I checked. We're not jumping online from the webinar session.
But just there is some information there about how you do it. You can see www.redbook.com.au. In fact, I mostly use this when people come to me having bought a car, which they said, well, I paid, the car yard said I was getting it interest free. I paid $12,000 for this car. The first thing I always do is jump onto this site to check what the value of the car was, or round about the value of the sorts of car that you're buying. So if you go into this site, and I have spoken to a number of clients when we've done more community events, and it's also good for financial counsellors or community workers to check this website again if you've got somebody coming in who said they bought this car and they've paid too much for it.
And I guess the other place it pops up is workers who are helping people who might have an NDIS plan and they might want a car that
or anything
like that as well.
Yeah, so any sort of reason why you would want to check what the value of a car is. So what in particular I like about this, the basic search is free.
Yep.
So there's no reason not to do the search. And the basic search gives you enough information to work out whether the car is in the ballpark as to what they're saying.
I guess the caveat I would put on this, Loretta, though, is let's say Red Book puts a value of somewhere between $9,000 and $12,000, and our clients paid $13,000. Does that make the contract illegal, like a couple of clients have told me before?
Oh, God, no.
No.
Sorry if I took...
There's nothing, and this is an important bit for the public and clients, that it's not illegal to overpay for something.
Absolutely not. And I think, but it gives you a guide.
But this is why you check beforehand and not afterwards.
No, yes, exactly right. So it gives what it does is if you fill in the make, model and year and then are able to find the exact model, sometimes it's a bit difficult, but you know, I sort of go around about and work out, well, it must be around this sort of a car. The clients can, or you can usually, as a person buying a car, you usually know it's a 4-door, you usually know it's an automatic. So you can get
and you've got an idea of the Ks usually.
Yeah, and the Ks. And so what it gives the price of the car when it's new, but then it gives you, and this is when it's really important, it provides the average kilometres that a car would have travelled at the time that you look for the value of the car. So if you're buying a car and it's within the price estimate range, but the average kilometres are supposed to be 100,000 and it's travelled 300,000, it's not going to be as valuable.
Agreed.
And the other thing that it provides good estimate, so it gives now the value of the car now, and it gives the value of the car if you're buying it privately, or if you've got it from, or if you're going to buy it as a caryard, or if you're using it as trading. So it's really good.
So we've confirmed our value. The next thing that we need to do is make sure nobody's going to knock on our door and try and repossess it. Right?
Yes. So how can you do that, Paul?
Well, let's just say the person you're buying it from had a loan to buy the car. And as we all know, when you have a loan, the lender will take security over the car. And the private seller, in our experience with clients, doesn't always tell you that there's a loan on the car. So how can you protect yourself?
Well, you can go to the Personal Properties Securities Register, and this is a national register. So it used to be a state-based register, but now it's national. And it's very easy to use. And in fact, one of the things that I always do if I'm doing this in person, a presentation, is to go through and actually do a search on the PPSR. It's very cheap as long as you go directly to the government website. So there's lots of information providers out there who'll do it for you, but obviously they'll charge you more than I think the $3 or something that it costs you to do a search. There is no excuse. I've done it sometimes when I have bought cars or privately. When I've been there inspecting the car, I said, can you give me the VIN number? Because that's what you need to go and do that. And I've actually put the VIN in. As I'm standing there, I can get I'll be told whether there's security on the car or not. And in fact, recently, I did one of those searches for a friend. It came up as a security. The person who was selling the vehicle actually didn't know about the security and got it taken off. But had that friend bought the car, it would have been a nightmare 3 months down the track.
And Loretta, there's a question that's come through that's worth dealing with now. We were talking about car dealers on Gumtree claiming they were selling privately. If you get car dealers like that, my view is they should be being licensed and they can't be selling. they're either selling as a car dealer or they're not.
And I think you should make a complaint
To the Office of Fair Trading.
Yeah,
If you,
and maybe if a fair trading person on the line has a different view, please let us know.
No, but I definitely think you should be dealing with them as if they're a licensed car dealer.
Yes,
and exercising the client's rights as if they were a licensed car dealer. And at the same time, Office of Fair Trading or your equivalent in other states will be very interested in that.
And the other thing that it really is good for, if we can just go back, Paul, because I thought it also says if it's on the written off register.
Yep.
And this is important for insurance.
Yep.
Because often you can't get insurance on a vehicle that's on the written off register.
Yep.
There is a difference between it being a repairable write-off and on the written off register. But that's why you want to know, and you want to check with an insurance. You might still want to buy that car. It's not that you can't buy the car, but you'd want to check with your insurance company before you go and purchase.
And that was a big issue in Brisbane. There was those massive hailstorms at Halloween at the end of last year, and following that, there were hundreds of cars advertised with severe damage that would be caught by exactly what you're saying.
Yes, if it's repairable, right? So just check with your insurance company about that.
All right, so let's move ourselves along a little bit. Transferring the vehicle, and this is a Queensland specific slide.
Absolutely. So we won't do too much about it, except to say that when you buy the car privately, you need to transfer transfer the vehicle into your own name.
And this is always my concern around people who sign up to rent to buy car contracts. Because the rego is not normally transferred until the very end of the contract. And most people we see don't successfully make it through the 3 years of overpaying to rent and then buy a car.
Yes. So if the vehicle's not transferred into your name, you've got problems, particularly if you think it should have. And I am going to talk a little bit more about that, because especially about making claims under the claim fund, because it has become more of an issue with motor dealers. And I've been practicing for too long now, and I've never seen such a proliferation of people complaining about not having clear title to a car that they've bought from a motor car dealer.
And thank you to the Office of Fair Trading, who's just made the point that they're seeing a lot of issues with backyard persons buying repairable write-offs, fixing them, and then not telling people when they're selling them that it was a repairable write-off.
Yeah.
So getting that true history of the car is really important.
That's why you want to go to PPSR.
Yep.
Absolutely. So it basically.
So here's our beware on a private purchase of a car.
So you're not entitled to a cooling off period.
Yep.
Check.
No consumer guarantee protection.
Check.
No statutory warranty.
No statutory warranty. The seller does not have to give you a personal property security certificate or clear title guarantee. And most importantly, you won't be able to claim if something goes wrong. And I know that we're going to talk about the Queensland Civil and Advocacy Tribunal in a minute, but most importantly, if you really think that there is a contractual breach, so all of these contracts, when you buy privately, it's likely that there won't be anything as such in writing, except you might have something like, I sold this car to such and such for this amount of money.
Yep.
Sign here. So, of course, it's still a contract.
Absolutely. But you don't have as great a protection.
Well, your avenues of redress are very limited. So if you are if somebody said to you, this is a 1985 Maserati and it ends up being a 2005 Toyota Corolla, then your only avenue of redress would be to go to the court system. because they've misled you when they entered the contract with you. It's a completely different avenue of redress. It's very expensive. You're liable for costs if you don't succeed. You want to be very careful about buying things privately.
Yep. All right, so buying a car from a car yard, they're licensed, which helps us, doesn't it? Or it helps our clients because it brings in all the protections we were talking about that you don't have when you're buying from a private seller.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you, well, we're going through it now. When you're entitled, when you're buying from a car yard, you get to test drive the vehicle.
And let's be clear about test driving the vehicle. You don't have to sign something to be allowed to test drive a vehicle. Occasionally, we've seen clients get themselves into trouble because the car yard said you need to all pay a deposit. Good point. Because they will try and get you to sign a contract before you take it away to test drive it. And invariably, the car yard's doing the wrong thing in that regard are actually signing you up to a sales contract.
Yes.
So be very careful about that because those car yards routinely will try that on. We can usually undo it at the other end, but it takes a lot more hassle than if you just say, no, I'm not signing it. I'm entitled to test drive it without paying you any money or signing for anything.
So again, all this legislation applies in Queensland. And in Queensland, you have a 1 business day cooling off period, but only for used car.
Yes.
You have a statutory warranty.
Yes.
But only for certain vehicles.
Yes.
Not all vehicles. And the amount of vehicles, so of course if it's a car, it's fine. But there is a wider definition of what is a vehicle under the consumer guarantees, which we will talk about later, than there is under the state-based legislation.
And the other important thing on this slide is be aware that there's protection under the motor dealers legislation in Queensland. And connected to that, there is a claim fund which can compensate in some circumstances where the motor dealer has done the wrong thing.
Yes.
I don't propose to go into the detail of that necessarily.
A little bit. I don't mind because I have taken some, but not at the moment.
Not at the moment because we're already a little short of time, Loretta.
Are we already?
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, some would unkindly say that you and I could talk underwater.
All right, well, we'll talk about the claim fund just in brief. But yes, so the most important thing, so taking your claim to QCAT, so in Queensland, we have the Queensland Civil and Advocacy Tribunal, and that's where you take claims about motor vehicles that you've purchased from a car yard. You can't go there if you've purchased your car from your neighbour. And that's really important to understand. So you can, and that's also where there's been a failure to comply with the Australian consumer law, which is national legislation. And but the difference between the motor dealers and shadow auction, oh God, that's such a big word. Can we just do it the MDA?
Yeah, I'm happy with the MDA.
So if it's for used car, there will be statutory warranties under the MDA, and there will be consumer guarantees under the
ACL.
Under the ACL, which is the Australian consumer law, which I can never remember the legislation.
It's under the Competition and Consumer Act. It's a schedule to it, right?
Thank you very much. And also what happened in Queensland back in September 2019 was that there'd been a lot of angst with consumers around defective new cars as well, not just used cars.
Absolutely.
And so there was an inquiry, and there was new legislation introduced that were called lemon laws. so that if you bought a lemon, you were able to do something about it. But how did they actually, what did they actually do?
Well, the important bit about that legislation in my mind is it expanded the jurisdictional limit of QCAT to allow you to bring complaints about cars up to an amount of $100,000 instead of 25.
And it brought back statutory warranties,
which protected you for very old cars, essentially, which is really important for a lot of the clients we deal with because they often can't afford to buy a new car.
Yes.
And so it provides them with some protection.
So that means you can go to QCAT if you have bought a lemon.
And the other thing to say about lemon laws is that the end of last year, there was an amendment made to the Australian Consumer Law, was from memory at section 260, which specifically defined and looked at how many minor faults with a car would amount to a major fault.
And why is that important? What does a major fault do?
Well, because the major fault allows you to ask for a refund or a replacement, where if it's a minor fault, the motor dealer has options of a repair, a refund, or a replacement, and will nearly always repair it because it's cheaper.
Yes, and what you have to understand is that the Australian
Consumer Law,
or the guarantees and the warranties can run side by side.
Absolutely.
So the statutory warranties under the MDA are very time specific and kilometres travel specific and gives particular rights in relation to what the motor dealer must do.
Absolutely.
But that doesn't stop you from also arguing that the motor dealer has breached the consumer guarantees if you have to take it to QCAT.
Absolutely.
All right. The only thing that the statutory warranties under the MDA only apply to used cars, but on top of that, they only apply not to all vehicles. So they are more limited in the vehicles that they will apply to.
Also, just before we leave this point, be aware extended warranties, Loretta, don't often provide any greater benefit to you than is provided under the consumer guarantees. Would that be fair?
Under the consumer guarantees or under the statutory warranties, and are often very expensive. So, or will only give you. You might pay $1,000 for it, and the limits on one claim might very well be
$400, like we've seen before.
Yes. So I often don't think that they're that valuable. So
now this is the claims fund, Loretta. Let's move to that briefly.
This, well, you can read there.
Yeah.
What sort of claims that you can make to the Agents Financial Administration Act Fund, or the claims fund that they call it. However, you can't make a claim if the motor dealer won't comply with their obligations under their statutory warranty provisions.
Yeah.
The one that we see the most has been, and I've never seen it before, but this thing about giving clear title, or I have seen inappropriately using deposits paid.
Yep.
And not dealing with that deposit money properly. They're the things that I've started to see. And the good thing about this is that the claim fund pays, and if the motor dealer does, so if there's a decision made and the motor vehicle dealer can't pay, it's paid by the claim fund. And this is particularly useful if the motor dealer has gone into liquidation.
Okay. Now, just before we move on, Loretta, we've been picked up on our maths. PPSR searches are $2, not $3. We're overcharged. we're overcharging people.
The thing about well, I just wanted to be. I always think it's better to overstate the costs than underestimate.
And then another couple of questions come through. It's what we didn't talk about is if you're not told about material defects in a car, there is a section that potentially might allow you to avoid a contract
Mm.
under, it's in the section 100s of the Act, where you're not notified about
I think I did have a note about that, but
or given notice that the car is materially defective. So that's back on our repairable write-offs again.
yeah. So I think maybe we could send that to people, because obviously this is someone who's been really good from the Office of Fair Trading and has given us that information. So I really do appreciate it. The thing about the agents, the claim fund, is you must make the complaint within a year of becoming aware of it, or within 3 years of the false or misleading statement or the failure to give clear title. And sometimes people don't realise it's happened, that they don't have clear title. And you'd go, why wouldn't they know? But sometimes they just don't know. So it's really important that they get in within that 3 years.
And I think I also misspoke, Loretta. It's not that the car is materially defective, it's the forms that you're giving notice of.
Oh, yes, yes.
So let's be clear about that. My English is failing me today in addition to my maths.
Yeah, so this is the basic process that you complain to the motor dealer.
Yep.
You've got time limits. Then the claim is assessed by the Office of Fair Trading.
And this is under the claims fund, Loretta?
Yeah, and you can look all that information I really got from the Office of Fair Trading website, or the state government website.
Which has, and we use it fairly regularly, has great information around cars and your rights and things like.
Absolutely.
So I would recommend those of you who have not looked at that website, it's well worth your time.
So I thought we'd go on to here, because we should actually talk a little bit about this before we
hit questions.
Yes, because we've got quite a few.
Yes.
Okay, good. I like questions.
So buying from a car yard. So Fair Trading website. Let's just quickly. Fair Trading website from memory is www.oft.qld.gov.au.
I think it's Fair Trading.
Fair Trading.
Don't worry.
What Queensland? It's changed recently on me then, and thank you for putting it in the comments. www.qld.gov.au/fair trading. So I have the words right. I just had it in the wrong way.
So the most important thing is, when you're entering a contract, it is also important that when you buy from a car yard that you check the condition of the car.
Yep.
Because really claiming on a statutory warranty or consumer guarantee is quite difficult and requires quite a lot of evidence. Saying the car is crap
isn't going to cut it.
Is not enough, and trying to get evidence from mechanics who are prepared to give evidence if required in the tribunal
is actually really hard.
It's really hard, isn't it? Because
they're often relying on the car yards for work.
Well, and not only that, they're not getting, our clients can't pay
them. Also true.
So why would they want to give up half a day to end up in a tribunal having to argue about whether the car was defective or not? So it's always better to do some of that checks as well, and you can always make your contract subject to an RACQ inspection.
And getting finance is another really important one, right?
Yes, of course. We always say make it, even though you should always get advice if you happen to sign a contract and there's reasons why you don't want to proceed with it, get advice as soon as possible. But when you're entering the contract, don't sign as a referee. They're the sort of things that we've had from people. Paul's one about you can't test drive the car without
signing a contract,
or pay a deposit now and we'll to hold the car. It's a really bad thing.
Or the other one is you go into the financier who's on site and they say to you, mate, your mate's buying the car, and they say to you, oh, just sign this so the mate can get the loan. Please don't sign.
No.
Just don't, because it's got nothing. It's finding a way to grab you in when you're not sure about your rights.
Yes. So the things that I always love doing this, because you really want to watch out for finance from car yards. The other,
it's expensive. It's unregulated. Usually, if they're trying to get you to take a lease.
Yeah, it may be unregulated. You could be entering into a rent to buy. The other thing is they usually have a brokerage arrangement. Yeah, and they have that brokerage arrangement, which is meant to break the nexus between what the car yard knows and what the lender is, the knowledge of the lender, or it's meant to break the nexus between the lender's knowledge and of what the client's situation is, and make the broker liable. Which just adds to the confusion for consumers as well. One of the things that we always have here with finance is people will come to us and say, I signed this contract at the car yard, I can't afford it anymore. I know I can't afford it, and they're saying that they've got finance for me. Just because there is finance that's been approved, you can still do something about it. You do really need to get advice about that.
That's a legal advice one. That's not one we can really deal with.
No. Insurance, but that's where we're talking again. It's so important to get legal advice early. And I have managed a number of times over the years to help people through that process as to how they might be able to cancel legally after that 1 day cooling off period. But you need advice.
And there's a question come through, Loretta, that I would love the specific example of this, that where if a client discovers it's more expensive to pay cash than if they enter into finance to buy a car. I want the contract.
That's so funny.
I am desperate to see how a car yard has written a contract to cause that as a problem, because that to me says they're trying to get around, they're trying to make money possibly through a brokerage fee or a kickback from the lender. But I'm really, really interested in hearing more about that.
Or they just want people to enter into loans because...
But it makes no sense to me that what's in it for the car yard to do that.
And they might also be breaching some of the
rules. There's a fair chance they're doing something wrong. Please let us and Office of Fair Trading or your equivalent know about it so we can look further.
Now, when you do purchase a car on finance, there are some mandatory insurances. So comprehensive car insurance, obviously that's different to registering a car where you need third-party insurance. But that's covering people. But when you get finance, the only real insurance that they can require you to obtain is comprehensive car insurance. Everything else, every warranty,
is not required.
It's not required.
And yet you pay thousands for it, and you usually finance it as well.
Yeah. So again, you really want to get some advice about that.
So if things go wrong, come to us. Legal advice.
Yes.
If it's finance and insurance related, we want AFCA.
Yes.
And if it's problems with cars, it's legal advice, Office of Fair Trading, and
there are some really good resources, really, just on
the Office of Fair Trading website.
Office of Fair Trading website. The Queensland Civil and Advocacy Tribunal.
Administrative Tribunal. I know it's a mouthful.
Administrative.
Let's just call it QCAT.
QCAT. It's such a good title. QCAT. You can just go there as well, and there's some really good resources there as well. So, are there any more questions? And what time are we tracking on time?
We are tracking a little bit behind time. But let's go to some of the questions we got from the audience beforehand, because some of these are really important. So let's start with the top one. Car with brake issues, return it to the dealer and ask for a refund, but they said no. And it's gone to the Office of Fair Trading.
They didn't want to talk to the Office of Fair Trading. What should I do? Legal advice?
Yeah.
But it's likely that it will really turn on whether, and this is all for Queensland, whether this is a major fault or minor fault. It depends on how long you've purchased the car, whether there's a statutory warranty, or so for a whole range of reasons. It's not such an easy question. But the first thing I would always do in that is, what evidence have you got
about the brake failures?
Absolutely, because you're not going to get anywhere if the motor dealer isn't prepared to even talk to you or the Office of Fair Trading. You're really probably going to have to take the next step, which is your own legal action.
And a good local mechanic is really important, I find, in that space. Now, just before we go to the next question, what role do we see community workers and financial counsellors having in this space? I would start with helping the clients gather that sort of information you just mentioned.
Yes. Absolutely.
To me, is a big part of what role they could play.
Yeah, because often the clients aren't capable of doing that or find it very difficult to go and do. And sometimes, look, sometimes I've had to have the tough conversations and say the amount of evidence that you're going to have to gather, you need to make a decision about whether you've got the energy to go and do this.
And the time.
And the time.
And the money.
Yes, because these are not matters that, there might be some community legal centres that can help you, but it's usually you have to take the lead, you have to take the action yourself.
And QCAT's effective. You might have seen in the news, I think it was earlier this week, somebody successfully got a $79,000 judgment out of what I'll kindly describe as a faulty, defective luxury car. So the system is working. Yeah. But for our clients, it's harder to access.
Absolutely, because they don't have the costs.
So next question is around buying a car from a family member. This is always fraught with danger, isn't it, Loretta?
Well, exactly, because really all those consumer guarantees won't apply. So you're back to contract law, and what were the promises made in the contract about that? There's not much written and not much was said, and your rights are very limited.
And they're really against your family member.
And you have to think they're against your family member.
And you have to think whether taking your family member through a court process is conducive to good family relationships. And you might decide it is, but that's not for Loretta and I to comment.
But that's usually some of the things, and we know this. These are some of the issues. We may tell clients that the best legal option is a particular course of action, but clients themselves will also always have other things that are important to them, like family connection and relationships.
And the classic statement I always have, Loretta, is the legal answer is this, but the practical answer may well be B.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we have all those strategies.
And feel free, as we're going through these questions, everyone, to put any other questions you've got in the question box, and we'll get to them as we go.
Yeah.
Next one is around a young person who's 25 years old. They have been involved in an at-fault car accident. They are not listed as a driver on the motor vehicle insurance. Should they go through the insurance where the excess is more than the damage? Well, I'm not sure it's the issue. There's an issue here around the excess and damage. The issue is whether or not the insurance claim would even be paid.
Yes, and that just depends on the policy. The policy might very well have said Well, if you've got somebody
who's not a listed driver
and they're involved in a car accident and they're under 25, this will be your excess.
Or
yes,
they might say, if you've got somebody under 25 who drives a car and is not listed, we are not paying the claim.
Yeah, so it will depend on what's on the policy, but the excess is more than the damage to both cars?
Well,
or is it just one car?
So all we've got is the value of the damage repairs.
So if the excess is more than the total amount of the damage repairs, well, you don't have to claim.
You don't have to lodge a claim, and it might not be financially worth it.
And this would be the only time we would ever say,
don't claim. That's right. It's rare.
It's rare.
Can we explain novated leases, Loretta?
Oh my God.
We don't have the hours.
But yeah, so basically, well, the biggest problem with novated leases is when the employee, so it's usually loans that are,
it's usually an employment-related lease.
Yes, that's a good way of describing it. The relationships will depend on the terms and conditions of the lease. However, the biggest issue is when people lose their employment, that they are responsible for the lease payments, and that's when they usually come to us.
Yeah.
So it's not. It is an agreement that's anyway. I don't want to go into it any more than that.
I think what I would say is as a general rule, you have less protections than you would if you had a finance contract regulated by the National Consumer Credit Protection Act and Code.
Absolutely. So that's what you really want to think about when you're looking at entering into.
And the important bit of that, when people have lost their job, is they have no right, like you do under the National Credit Code, to seek financial hardship and have that considered.
So that's where you really want to be very careful about novated leases. They can be a great thing, and they can be a great thing depending on your personal circumstances. But the big risk is what happens when you lose your job. And I think they're the sort of questions you should possibly be asking your employer and the finance provider before
you sign the contract. Absolutely. Now, the next question is around: is it legal to sell a car privately if it is currently registered without a roadworthy certificate?
I'm not sure. And I don't want to. And one, it will be. I suspect not that you should have a roadworthy certificate before you sell a car in Queensland. But
I just haven't looked at the law recently enough to answer.
And it's not the sort of thing that we usually deal with.
No. And I think we've covered in a lot of ways what can a customer ask and be sure of before signing.
Yeah. So is there any other questions?
So another one that's come through that I think is a really good one, Loretta, is there any protection for people with a disability or may have barriers understanding the contract when purchasing it?
Well, usually these matters come to us when there's finance attached to it. So of course, with contracts, it's all about how much do people understand, and you can make an argument that a contract is unconscionable based on whether the person has capacity.
Yeah.
However, we don't want, as a general rule, just because somebody has an intellectual disability.
We don't want to prevent it from being able to buy stuff.
Yes. So it is, I think it's something that needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. The more complex the arrangement, the more explanation would need to be given
of it
for a person with, say, an intellectual disability to be able to understand the contract.
And another really important part of that, Loretta, is empowering the person with the disability to be able to say, I need to take the contract away and think about it.
Yes, which doesn't happen
very often.
But my big issue is that we don't want to see people with limited capacity not being able to purchase goods because they lack capacity. The other issues about with contracts in and of itself is really there are two limbs as to capacity in, and this is really a legal question, and you'd really want to have a look at it on a case by case basis. But generally there has to be two things that are satisfied. One is that the person lacks capacity, which you can often get from a doctor to say this person lacked capacity at the time. But the second thing that you need to get evidence of is that the other party should have known that the person lacked capacity. And that's often where you can't get that evidence. It's easier with people with an intellectual disability because sometimes if they can't speak at all, but it is often impossible when you're talking about mental illness.
And I guess the other thing we haven't talked about, Loretta, is we talked about the cooling off period. What we didn't say is you can take it away for an independent inspection or a test drive during the cooling off period. But if you drive the car away for any other reason, what happens to the cooling off period?
You lose your cooling off period.
Yep. So looking quickly at some of the other questions that have come through. There's one around buying a car off a mate and the mate it blowing up and the mate not having any money.
Well,
you're in a bit of trouble.
Because you're not going to be able to recover. So your only avenue of redress is against the mate. Even if you do have redress, which will depend on what the terms and conditions of the verbal contract are, but even if you did and you took legal action, you wouldn't be able to recover. So in those circumstances, often I might say, even if there is a very strong case, that what's the point? If they're long-term unemployed or on a DSP, you're not likely to be able to recover.
And the added bit to that is if they forgot that they had security on the car, you're even more stuffed.
Yes, because then they can take the car, and your mate could be in trouble.
And the other question that's come through, and this is probably the last one we've got time for, and I've seen a little bit of this too, is people who have been stuck with inappropriate vehicles that they bought when they access their super through COVID or various other reasons. So they don't have a finance problem,
but they've
got a car problem. So it's the same remedies we've already talked about, isn't it?
Same remedies. So it will just depend on the condition of the car, whether they've got access to statutory warranties or consumer warranties. But if they bought a Maserati instead of a people mover, which they should have, because they've got 6 children,
not an appropriate car.
That's not going to get you a right to cancel it or to get a refund.
The other thing, though, we should acknowledge, just as we're finishing, though, is accessing these remedies. And Queensland's a good example, WA is a good example, and parts of South Australia too, can be harder the more remote you are.
Absolutely, because you can't even get a mechanic
to look at the car in some cases. And we've seen cases like that where it's harder to access your rights because often, and I will use Cairns as the example, people from the more remote places in North Queensland will often make their way to Cairns to buy a car, buy it secondhand and start to drive it back. And in some cases it's broken down on the way back.
And trying to get the evidence together
can be very difficult.
And it can be impossible. So these are some of the issues.
The practical challenges that we all need to consider when we're considering people's legal rights, I think.
And that's often the case because people may often have legal rights, but the practicalities of doing something about it are so expensive and time consuming.
And unfortunately in that space, there are caryards that target First Nations people.
Yes. But I have had people say, Loretta, I'm determined. I am determined to go and do this because I don't want another caryard doing this sort of thing in future. And I think we need people like that too. But just as long as those people understand that this can be a very onerous process. And it's the reason why, if a settlement that's made by the other side is reasonable or in the ballpark, we encourage people to think about accepting it.
Agreed. All right. We are absolutely out of time, Loretta. So can we thank all of you? Well, just because I'm already over time, unconscionable conduct is very difficult to prove in this space. I'm happy for somebody, if you want to talk about unconscionable conduct, for you to contact us directly, and we're happy to have a chat about that. So thank you all for your attendance today. Loretta and I, as usual, have had a lovely chat with ourselves for an hour, which we always enjoy doing. We hope you got a great benefit from it. And we would encourage you to look ahead for future webinars. We are planning other car-related webinars on things like tolls and finance and insurance, but we're unable to give you any dates on that. Also, keep a lookout for podcasts that we're developing that we're hoping to get out in the near future as well. Thank you for your time today. If you please have a look at the feedback survey that will pop up when you exit the webinar. We're always grateful for feedback about what worked well and what didn't.
And especially if you say something nice about me.
But the other important bit is we have done webinars as a direct result of the feedback we've gotten in that feedback survey.
Absolutely. And this was one of them.
Yeah.
So if there's anything that you particularly want or that you don't think we covered or you think we could go into more depth about, please let us know and we'll put that in for future webinars.
No. All right. Thank you for your time, everyone. And I will end the webinar now.